Hey guys, welcome to The Last Climb, and today I'll show you what happened when an arrogant couple decided they didn't need their Sherpa anymore at the last camp at Manaslu.
They had hired one of the best guides in the Himalaya, and somewhere high on the mountain, they decided to kick him off the expedition. But what ended up happening to them next was so brutally punishing, you'll realize how absolutely incredible Sherpas really are. It was September 28th, 2019, and a thin, brittle wind was scraping across Camp 4 on Manaslu, the highest tents on the mountain, pitched on a shelf of ice and rock at around 24,400 feet. This is the last stop before the summit, the place where climbers pull on their down suits, clip onto their oxygen, and try to rest before leaving in the dark. Most teams were doing some version of that, readying themselves for summit night. In one of those tents, though, a married couple and the veteran Sherpa they had hired were having a conversation that none of the people nearby would ever forget. A conversation that ended with the most experienced mountaineer on their team being told he was no longer needed. The couple were Garland and Delamay Sturdivant, 34 and 32, from Glendale, California. Garland had built a chain of auto body shops from one garage with the confidence that comes from winning early and often. Delamay was a dentist, precise and competitive, the planner of the two. They were strong, fit marathon runners who had topped Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua and a smaller Himalayan peak the year before, and had come to Manaslu as a stepping stone toward Everest. On paper, they belonged there. The trouble was never their bodies. Here is the thing you have to understand about how they saw this climb. To Garland and Delamay, the expedition was a product. They had researched it like a purchase, paid heavily for it, and arrived expecting the service they had bought. And when you believe you have bought a mountain, the people guiding you stop looking like experts keeping you alive and start looking like staff you are paying to say yes.
Paying a fortune for the climb does not guarantee your safety, and I watched them forget that completely.
On a mountain, the people you hire are the reason you get to go home. Manaslu rises to 26,781 feet in north-central Nepal, the 8th highest mountain in the world. And over the last decade, it has earned a quiet, dangerous nickname as the Easy 8000er. It is climbed in the autumn, it has a relatively forgiving lower route, and a growing number of Everest aspirants have used it to prepare for that bigger climb. But the word easy does a lot of damage on a mountain like this. People arrive expecting a warm-up and forget that the summit still sits firmly in the death zone, to the altitude above 26,000 feet where the air holds so little oxygen that the body is dying by degrees the entire time it stays. Manaslu also has a darker history than the nickname admits, including an avalanche in 2012 that tore through the camps and killed almost a dozen climbers in a single morning. It is not gentle, only gentle enough, often enough, that people let their guard all the way down. The danger, on Manaslu, hides at the top. The lower mountain is glaciers and crevasses and a few steep pitches, but the upper mountain opens into a vast, gently sloping plateau of snow that runs toward a narrow, corniced summit ridge. In good weather, it is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. In bad weather, it becomes a featureless white room with no walls and no floor you can trust, threaded with hidden crevasses, where the only thing telling you which way is down is a line of thin bamboo wands the route-fixing teams plant in the snow, and the fading footprints of the people ahead of you. The true summit itself is a corniced fin of snow so sharp and exposed that for years many climbers stopped just short of it and called it close enough. Beyond a point, it stops being a walk and becomes a tightrope, where the line between the safe plateau and a fatal drop can be a few feet of snow that may not hold.
Calling Manaslu the Easy 8000er makes people drop their guard, and to me, that false comfort is what gets them killed.
That distinction matters more than almost anything else on this climb. A guide who has been up Manaslu many times carries the route in his head, knows where the wands run, knows which gentle slope leads home, and which one leads out over a cornice or into a crevasse field. A first-timer in a whiteout has none of that. To a newcomer, every direction on that plateau looks identical, and the most natural feeling downhill line can walk you straight off the edge of the mountain or out onto a shelf of snow hanging over a 2,000-foot drop. The man the Sturdivants had hired to carry all of that knowledge for them was named Pasang, 38 years old, a Sirdar with more than a dozen 8,000-meter summits behind him, several of them on Manaslu itself. He was calm, unhurried, and quietly stubborn about safety in the way that climbers who have buried friends tend to be. His job was not just to break trail and manage their oxygen. His real job, the one that mattered most, was to know when to say no, and to be willing to say it to 2 paying clients who did not like that word. He had grown up in the high country, started carrying loads as a teenager, and worked up to leading clients on the tallest peaks on Earth. Over the years, he had turned people around just short of summits and absorbed their fury, then watched the weather prove him right an hour later. He had long ago decided he would rather lose a summit than a climber.
The top of Manaslu is a broad, glaciated plateau threaded with hidden crevices, and I cannot overstate how easily people vanish there.
That friction had been building for the entire expedition. On the acclimatization rotations, Pasang had set a conservative pace, and the Sturtevants had chafed at it, convinced their fitness entitled them to move faster. He had asked them to drink more, rest more, and turn their oxygen down to conserve it, and they had treated each instruction as a negotiation. More than once they had overruled him on small things and been fine, and every time nothing went wrong, their belief that they knew better hardened a little more. By the time they reached the upper mountain, they had stopped hearing his caution as expertise. On one rotation, he had them descend when Delamay developed a headache bad enough that he preferred to lose altitude and play it safe, and they grumbled that he was babying them. The headache passed, as it often does, and in their minds that proved him wrong rather than careful. Each small win over his caution was a withdrawal from an account they did not know they were emptying, and that is the quiet trap that the easy reputation sets. Their confidence had never actually been tested, because nothing had gone wrong yet. They had mistaken a string of good days for their own skill. So when the most experienced man on the mountain started sounding careful, they did not hear decades of hard-earned judgment. They heard an employee being difficult, an obstacle between them and the summit they had paid for.
Pasang had summited more 8,000ers than this couple had nights in a tent, and I watched them treat him like a frickin' servant.
The plan for summit day was the same one every team on the mountain follows. Leave Camp 4 in the dark, sometime around midnight. Climb through the cold hours on bottled oxygen, and aim to stand on the summit not long after sunrise. The reason for the timing is simple and strict. You want to be back down off the exposed upper plateau and into camp before the afternoon, because on Manaslu the weather almost always builds through the day, and the clear morning sky has a habit of turning into cloud and snow by early afternoon. The whole system depends on being early. Being late is how people die up there. It also runs on oxygen someone is actively managing. On Manaslu, clients climb on bottled gas from the high camps up, with a guide watching the gauge, turning the flow up for hard sections and down to conserve, and swapping bottles at planned points. Left to a frightened, hard-breathing client, a day's supply can be gone hours before the day is. The Sturtevants reached Camp 4 on the afternoon of the 28th, and they reached it slowly. The climb up from Camp 3 had taken them longer than planned, and they arrived tired, a little ragged, and behind the schedule Pasang had laid out. He watched them come into camp, watched how long it took them to settle, and started doing the quiet arithmetic that veteran guides are always doing, the math of how slow a client is now against how much slower the thin air will make them in the hours to come. The numbers he was running did not look good. Other climbers noticed them come in, the long pauses, the heavy way they sat on their packs, how long simple tasks took in the thin air. None of it was alarming on its own. Together, to an experienced eye, it was a portrait of 2 people already near their limit, at the place where the hardest part had not yet begun.
Reaching the last camp already behind schedule is the kind of warning I wish more climbers treated as a verdict.
Slow down, low, almost always means slower up high, every single time. Then he looked at the sky. Through that afternoon, while the couple rested in the tent, Pasang watched the clouds. He saw the high haze thickening to the south, felt the wind shifting, and read the same forecast the expedition leaders down at base camp were reading. The one that suggested the clean morning window would be narrow and that weather would likely move in by the middle of the next day. He put it all together, their slow pace, their fatigue, the tightening window, and he reached the conclusion he was paid to reach. For these 2 clients, on this night, the summit was not safe. He was not guessing at any of this. Expedition teams kept up regular radio contact with base camp whenever conditions allowed, trading the shifting forecast models, the width of the window, the hour the wind was due to rise, and every professional on the mountain was already shortening their plans because of what the data showed. so he told them. In the tent that evening, Pasang laid it out as plainly as he could through the language between them that they were moving too slowly, that the weather was turning, and that if they left for the summit, they would not get back across the plateau before it closed in. He gave them two honest options in so many words. Go down now, with the climb unfinished, or accept a hard turnaround time so early that the summit was almost certainly out of reach. What he would not do was lead them into a storm above 26,000 feet.
When Pasang looked at that sky and called it off, I would have trusted his read over any forecast on Earth.
The Sturdivants did not take it well. They had trained for 2 years, spent a fortune, and arranged their whole lives around standing on this summit, and now the man they were paying was telling them to quit within reach of the top, they argued. They told him, in so many words, that they had not come all this way to be turned around by someone overcautious, that they felt strong, that other teams were going. To them, his caution looked like weakness, or laziness, or unwillingness to earn the money they had paid. They had overruled him a dozen times already and been fine. This felt like just one more, so they let him go. Not in anger, which is almost the worst part, but coldly, the way you would end a contract whose terms you no longer liked. They rejected his turnaround call outright, told him they would climb independently from there, and informed him that they no longer required his services. They would summit on their own, they said, by following the other teams and the fixed line. They were within their rights in the narrow sense that no rule could force two adults to stop, and there was nothing, in the end, that Pasang could physically do to make them. He tried one more time. Before they left, he told them the things that mattered most, that the wands were the only way to find the route home, that they had to watch their oxygen carefully, with no one managing it for them, and that the moment visibility started to deteriorate, they had to turn around and not push on. Then he did the only thing a guide can do when clients dismiss his judgment. He stayed in his tent at Camp 4, unwilling to lead them into a storm and unwilling to climb down alone into the dark, and he radioed the operator below to report what was happening. When the couple clipped in and left a little after midnight, he stayed behind. The other teams in camp saw a Sirdar remain in his tent while his clients walked off into the night without him, and they understood exactly what it meant.
Firing the one person who knew the way down at the last camp is something I will never understand.
He was their route, their oxygen plan, and their way home, all in one person. I think about what Pasang sat with that night in his tent at Camp 4, because it was more than wounded pride. He still carried the route, the entire map of how to get off that plateau alive, locked inside his own head. He still carried the judgment that had kept him breathing for nearly 20 years up high. And he carried the awful knowledge, I am certain, that the two people who had just dismissed him had thrown away the single best chance they had of ever coming back down. A little after midnight, the Sturdivants left Camp 4. They clipped onto their oxygen, switched on their headlamps, and stepped out into a still, savage cold, somewhere around 20 below zero Fahrenheit, and started up behind the bobbing lights of the other teams. For a while, it must have felt like vindication. The sky was clear, the stars were enormous, and the route was a conga line of headlamps stretching up into the dark. They were doing it. They were going to prove the cautious Sherpa wrong. The cold alone is hard to put into words. At 20 below zero, in the dark, every exposed scrap of skin burns. The breath freezes onto the mask, and the simplest action, a zipper, a buckle, a clip, becomes a clumsy ordeal in thick gloves. This was the world they had entered without the one person who could read it for them.
Just the thought of walking out of that tent with no guide onto a peak neither of them had ever climbed absolutely terrifies me.
But the mountain does its own accounting. Without Pasang breaking trail and setting their pace, the couple climbed slower than the teams around them, and the gap opened steadily. One by one, the other parties pulled ahead, until the Sturdivants were near the back of the field, 2 headlamps trailing behind the rest. Worse, no one was managing their oxygen now. Pasang would have been watching their gauges, turning the flow up and down, timing each bottle change to make the supply last. On their own, breathing hard and anxious, they ran higher flow rates than planned and misjudged how much was left in each cylinder. And without him setting that rhythm, they burned through their oxygen faster than the climb allowed. Pasang would also have been the brake on their ambition, the one insisting they turn around when the clock said so. And that brake was now back in a tent at Camp 4, not on the rope beside them. By mid-morning, the couple still were not on the summit. The faster teams had already topped out and were on their way back down, passing the Sturdivants as the two of them ground slowly upward. two unguided climbers still well below the summit late in the morning, on a mountain whose weather turns by afternoon, is a day already lost. Every team that passed them was, in effect, a warning walking the other way, and every passing climber was a turnaround they chose not to take.
Summiting hours after everyone else means descending into the worst weather of the day, and I have watched that end in tragedy so many times at this point.
They reached the summit late in the morning, hours behind everyone else. By the accounts pieced together later, they got to the top of Manaslu, or near enough to it, long after the safe turnaround time had come and gone. For a few minutes they had what they had paid and trained and overruled a good man to get. They were standing higher than almost anyone else on Earth, alone on the roof of the 8th highest mountain in the world. And while they stood there, to the south, the cloud they had been warned about was already climbing the mountain toward them. A summit is a strange, dangerous finish line, because it is only ever the halfway mark. Everything they had focused on for 2 years ended at that highest point, but the mountain did not care. It still required them to reverse every step, across the plateau, down the ridge, back to the tents, while more tired, lower on oxygen, and later in the day than anyone responsible would allow. They had spent all their margin getting up and had nothing left for getting down.
People seem to forget that standing on the summit is only ever the halfway point, and I wish that one sentence were printed on every permit.
More climbers die going down than coming up. They started down into a changing world. The clear morning sky was gone, replaced by a flat, shadowless light as cloud rolled across the plateau and the first snow fell. Visibility began to shrink, slowly at first, the far peaks vanishing, then the nearer slopes, then the line of wands softening into the white. The footprints they had followed all night were filling in with snow and wind almost as fast as they had been made. Over the next hour or two, as they picked their way down, it kept getting worse, the cloud thickening and the snow falling harder, until the whiteout finally closed over them completely. There is a moment on that plateau when the cloud and the falling snow and the white ground all merge, where a person loses every reference point at once. There is no upslope or downslope you can see. No horizon, no shadow, nothing but a blinding, even gray-white in every direction. Experienced guides describe it as standing inside a ping-pong ball. For two exhausted people who had never been there before, with the one man who knew the route now thousands of feet below them, it was a sealed trap with no visible door. What makes a whiteout so lethal is that it strips away the things a newcomer leans on hardest. The sight of the route of other people. The simple sense of which way the ground falls. A veteran can sometimes pick a path through it by memory and instinct. To everyone else, it is a blindfold tied on at the worst possible moment.
A whiteout on that plateau turns the world into pure white blindness, and I heard that it's so disorienting that people would rather be actually blind.
They began to wander. Investigators later pieced together the rough shape of what happened, from the position of their bodies relative to the route and from what other climbers had seen, and the picture is a slow, terrible drift. After losing sight of the wands and watching the footprints fill in under fresh snow, with Pasang nowhere near them, the couple lost the thread of the route and began moving across the plateau on instinct. And for climbers who did not know that dome, instinct is almost always wrong. They were not descending the line that led to Camp 4. They were traversing out across the open snowfield, away from the tents, into the part of the mountain where the crevasses hide and the cornices overhang the void. Every step in that direction carried them farther from the tents and deeper into the ground that gives no second chance for a wrong guess. Those wands and the old footprints were the only map up there, and I watched the falling snow erase both. Somewhere in that wandering, their oxygen ran out. With no one rationing the bottles, the couple had burned through their supply faster than the climb allowed, and high on that plateau, in the cold and the effort and the rising panic, the gas simply ran out. Losing supplemental oxygen at that altitude is not always sudden, but it is merciless. Over the time that followed, the cold drove in deeper, their legs turned to stone, and their minds, already starved, slowed and clouded further, exactly when the situation demanded the sharpest thinking.
Managing oxygen properly that high takes constant attention, and with no one doing it, I knew their gas would run out early.
From there, the mountain worked quickly. hypoxia, deepening cold, and total exhaustion stack on one another, and body and mind shut down by stages. Coordination goes, then clear thought, then the will to keep fighting. Climbers in that state stop making decisions and start simply reacting, and then stop even that. The couple, lost and out of oxygen and out of strength, slowed and stumbled, and at some point could no longer move through the snow still falling around them in the failing light. There is a grim final stage to freezing when the body stops shivering, the sense of cold fades, and a person can even feel warm as the last defenses give out. From the outside, it does not look like a struggle. It looks like someone slowly growing calm and quiet in the snow.
Exhaustion at altitude does not feel like tiredness, and I need you to know it feels like the most reasonable rest imaginable.
Sitting down in that cold is how the worst of these stories end, and then, as the day drained away, they stopped. It is the quietest and most final thing that happens up there. Exhausted, freezing climbers reach a point where sitting in the snow feels like the most reasonable thing in the world, like rest, like relief, and the cruelty of severe cold is that it tells that lie right at the end. Somewhere out on that plateau, far from the route and far from the tents, the Sturtevants sat down in the snow together, out of oxygen, out of options, with the temperature falling and the night coming on. They had each other, and somewhere close in the storm, a route home that might as well have been on another mountain. Sitting down to rest in that snow is the decision people do not get back up from, and it breaks me how many times I've seen this pattern repeat. The night that followed was the coldest part of the story, and the loneliest. There would be no headlamps of a rescue team, because no rescue is possible across an unmarked, crevassed plateau in a whiteout at night, and because the other teams had long since come down off the upper mountain to the camps below before the weather fully closed in, while the Sturtevants had drifted far out of sight and far off the route. There were only two people who had started the climb together and had now lost everything but each other, sitting in the dark and the wind near the top of the world. The cold did to them what the cold always does at that altitude, slowly and without any mercy at all. Two headlamps that had been a bright, confident line hours earlier were now two small, failing glows out on a plateau no one could reach.
Two people who started the climb together ended it lost and freezing in the dark, and I cannot imagine that loneliness.
Garland and Delamay Sturtevant died that night, high on the Manaslu Plateau, from the combination that takes most people who stop moving up there, hypothermia and exhaustion, and the brutal impairment of altitude, lost not far from a route they could no longer find, undone by a single decision made in a tent the evening before. They had been on the mountain they paid to conquer, on the summit they trained for years to reach, and in the end, none of it mattered, because they had sent away the one person who knew the way home. They were never likely to come down on their own. From the moment they sent Pasang away, the odds were overwhelmingly against them. When the couple failed to return to Camp 4, the other teams and the expedition operator raised the alarm, and word went down the mountain to the liaison officer, and eventually to their family in California. Climbing conditions in the whiteout made any immediate search impossible, and it was several days, until a later weather window, before Sherpas heading up to climb spotted and reached their bodies out on the plateau, off the standard route, close together in the snow. Recovering anyone from that altitude is brutally difficult, and the mountain does not give its dead back easily. Their names were added to the steady, underreported toll the peak takes each season from people expecting something easier than what they found. Pasang, the man they fired, had stayed in camp that night and descended safely the next morning without a scratch. He had read the mountain correctly in every way, the pace, the weather, the window, the danger of that plateau, and was dismissed for it like a vendor who would not lower his price. That is the part that stays with anyone who hears this. The Sturtevants did not die because the mountain was unfair, or their gear failed, or they were unfit. They died because they paid for the best chance of survival money can buy on that peak, and then, on the last night, they sent it down the hill. He walked off that mountain without a scratch, the guide they fired, and to me he was always their one chance home. They paid for the one thing that could save them, then sent it down the mountain.
He walked off that mountain without a scratch. The guy they fired, and to me, he was always their one chance home. They paid for the one thing that could save them. Then they sent it down the mountain.